Welcome to A World History of Christianity, Chapter 5, Part 4. We are on page 179. Challenges under the Raj. Christians of 19th and 20th century India continued to be overshadowed by increasing European missionary activity and by the military, administrative, and technological presence of the enormous imperial system. Yet, while profoundly affected by the Raj, contributions made by Indian Christians themselves to the development of their own institutions continued to be as crucial as ever. As before, each new wave of Christian expansion brought changes. These changes were often profoundly radical, especially as the gospel was interpreted in new ways and extended to new peoples in ever lower strata of society, in ever more remote jungle areas, or in ever deeper ways in the lives of women and children. Governments came under increasing pressure to open doors, to carry out reforms, and to bring help to peoples in want, hitherto neglected peoples, such as the outcasts, the impaired and the diseased. Radical notions of humanity and society suggested that all people, men, women, and children, should be seen as intrinsically equal to each other, at least in the sight of God, and that they should be given equal access to protection and to basic needs, such as medicine, education, and opportunity. Many who graduated from missionary colleges, whether Christian or not, joined movements for reform, national self-determination, or more radical revolutionary changes. The wheel has turned and come full circle. Hostility toward Christians in India and toward foreign missionaries has again become a predominant attitude, if not the reigning policy of the government of India. This position, based upon clear-eyed and rational assessment of the logic of power, was certainly that of the East India Company's Raj. The entire structure undergirding the imperial system depended upon support from Hindu elites. Armed forces of some 300,000 men came from military castes who ruled over agrarian villages across the country, and administrative cadres of roughly another 300,000 provided bureaucratic skills which controlled the flow of information and revenue. It was these Hindus, especially Brahmins in the secretariats, who quietly helped to construct and shape what became modern Hinduism. Company Raj under the British became, at least unofficially, a Hindu Raj. Hostility toward India's Christians and towards foreign missionaries was palpable, despite local, occasional, and specific contradictions and exceptions. This was true despite times when, out of immediate pragmatic need, Christians who were on the ground were readily exploited, Catholic and evangelical missionaries alike being used as local military chaplains, school teachers, or diplomatic emissaries, e.g. sending Schwartz to Tipu Sultan. Except for occasional instances of persecution and martyrdom, e.g. John de Brito S.J. in Ramnad, Indian Christians and alien missionaries often fared better, receiving kinder treatment and were more successful in domains which remained outside European control, e.g. under Velama Nayakas of Madurai, Maravatevars, and Setupatis of Ramnad, and Sivaganga Kalar Tondemans of Pudukkottai, Maratha Rajas of Thanjavur, Nayar Raja Vermas of Travancore, and many others. In British-controlled districts, the cries of persecuted Christian villagers who sent appeals all the way to London during the last years of the 18th century fell on deaf ears. Such indifference, both in London and in India, while it began to diminish after 1813, did not disappear for another 50 or more years. The father of the modern missionary movement, at least in the eyes of Anglo-Saxon evangelicals, was William Carey. He and his fellow Baptists in England were the first to initiate the rise of voluntarism among grassroots believers whose Christian faith was revived during the Evangelical Awakening, or Great Awakening in America. Societies were formed, contributions were solicited, and overseas agendas were drawn up for the sending forth of missionaries to the far corners of the world. An inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversions of heathens, 1792, evoked in part from reading about deeds of German pietists in India, immediately led to the formation of the BMS and his departure for India. The formation of the LMS, CMS, and other societies on both sides of the Atlantic quickly followed. Since the company remained hostile and resisted free entry into British territories, Carey's group had difficulties until he was allowed to settle in the Danish station at Srirampur, or Serampore. He could not cross the Hooghly to work in Calcutta until he was hired to teach Oriental languages at Fort William College. Only by a sustained campaign in Britain, aided by a converted company director, Charles Grant, powerful friends in Parliament, Wilberforce Thornton, and an alliance with the Free Trade Lobby, was it possible to produce an insertion known as the Pious Clause into the company's Charter Renewal Act of 1813. Therefore, anyone denied entry into British India could appeal directly to the Board of Control, which was headed by a government minister. Free merchants and missionaries then began to arrive in ever greater numbers. Even so, company directors and officers continued to be both pragmatic and cautious, using missionaries when they were politically useful. Thus, subventions were provided for Roman Catholic vicars apostolic in Bombay. Catholic missionaries were used as chaplains for Irish contingents in company armies, and due to parliamentary pressures mounted by the evangelical lobby prior to 1813, some missionary chaplains went to India in the company's service. During the 1820s, the company also heeded the cries of Hindu reformers and Christian missionaries for the abolition of female infanticide and widow burning. Later in the century, moreover, the company's governments in India welcomed the arrival of increasing numbers of missionary teachers, physicians, and nurses. As missionary schools, colleges, and hospitals proliferated and spread out across the country in the late 19th century, multiplying into many hundreds, staffed by dedicated professionals and volunteers of societies from all over the world, including America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and countries of Scandinavia and Southern Europe, responses in India remained ambivalent. Some Hindus had grounds for feeling that, as Marx put it, foreign missionary activity in India was the handmaiden of imperialism. At the same time, officials in London had reason for caution. They and officers in India were ever wary of tactlessness, which might lead to disorder, and ready to expel summarily any missionary who might provoke social unrest. Westerners who denounced Hindu and Muslim practices by calling them devilish were admonished and sometimes punished. A governor of Madras was censured in the 1840s for using the term heathen in official communications. When devout servants of the company, both civil and military, organized a campaign against the official state involvement in idolatrous practices, e.g., the managing of temple property and functions for tens of thousands of institutions, protecting pilgrimage sites, requiring Christian soldiers to attend Hindu festivals, forcing hundreds of thousands, including Christians, to pull great temple cars in processions, Rath Yatras, which invariably saw some people crushed to death, and allowing temple dancing girls to function even though hundreds of thousands were forced to perpetual prostitution. The government summarily reprimanded them, including Bishop Spencer, and sacked their leaders, including General Peregrine Maitland. Some in the company blamed the 1806 Vellore Mutiny on excessive proselytizing zeal among Christians of India, a charge which resurfaced in connection with the Great Rebellion of 1857. The government of India eventually had even less reason for enthusiasm when missionaries sympathized with or rendered aid to the nationalist cause. As late as the 1930s and 40s, missionaries were being either interned or expelled as risks to security, even as other missionaries were exploited as intelligence officers on the Burma border. Relations between Christians in India continued to be fraught with conflicts and tensions. These occurred among and between Catholic, evangelical, or Protestant, and Thomas Christians, as well as among missionaries working with them. As numbers and varieties increased, not to mention complexities of relationship, as much attention was sometimes given to sheep stealing between Christian folds as to striving for conversions among non-Christians. This was vigorously done on all sides, with each side looking askance at the others. Each new wave, coming from the West, represented different or newer perspectives, philosophies, and theologies. And each new wave caused intergenerational strife, ardor tending to chill in older missionaries as in older institutions. Since newer waves of missionaries from abroad could avoid sheep stealing by looking for as yet unclaimed or wild sheep, the latest to come would tend to move into the remotest tribal areas or down into the lowest rungs of social structure, where ritually polluted or subhuman beings had been abandoned, at least by some standards. Among such people not yet Sanskritized or Islamicized, and eager to escape conditions in which they had lived for ages untold, spectacular successes were recorded, insomuch that, for example, virtually all Khasis, Mizos, Nagars, and similar peoples became Christians, and sometimes did so without ever becoming Hindu or Indian, a circumstance which has hindered their being ever fully nationalized, and has caused continuing troubles with the national government. But the biggest and most ceaseless and continuing of all ongoing arguments and conflicts, bringing about divisions and mutations among almost all Christian groups in India, regardless of whether they were Indians or Westerners, Catholics or evangelicals, Anglicans or dissenters, Martoma or Syrian, conservative or liberal, continued to swirl around issues of caste, culture, and acculturation. Indeed, since it is difficult to find any time in the history of Christians in India when this has not been a burning issue, this both remained and still is the enduring problem for all Christians in India. It is one which has never gone away, and one which is still bringing dissension and strife. Its dimensions are both historical and theological, with intermingling and intricate permutations which remain because every single Christian group which has ever existed in the subcontinent continues to exist, sometimes in a fossilized form, but more often in some revitalized and altogether new form. In theological terms, issues of unity and pluralism provide a polarity of seemingly endless and paradoxical contradictions. In historical terms, what has been involved is the challenge of finding acceptance within the fullest sense of humanity without at the same time causing damage or rejection in the contexts of various specific communities. But in addressing these complexities, it is important to recognize that behind the issue of caste and culture conflicts in all their manifold forms lies a shadow or ghost issue, which in the harsh light of analysis never went away. For Indian Christians, what was at issue as disturbing in recent centuries as in earlier times, has always been the very presence of missionaries themselves. By definition, missionaries were agents of change and disturbers of the status quo. This sense of alien intrusion was experienced by Indians, Christians and non-Christians alike. Clashes between alien influences and indigenous institutions were more than simply religious or theological. They were cultural, ecclesiastical, and political. If and when alien missionaries were opposed by political regimes within which they worked, then alien Christians and indigenous Christians tended to find common ground and could look to each other for mutual solace and support. But if and when any alien Christians, or just some out of many missionaries, and alien rulers of the same culture, even if indifferent to religion, found common ground or became inextricably linked politically, then Indian Christians found themselves marginalized and or obliged both to collaborate and change or submit to domination. This they resented. At no time were the majority of missionaries, from some 60 Catholic and some 50 non-Catholic missionary societies, whether British or not, predisposed in favor of colonialism. Indeed, pre-colonial, non-colonial, and anti-colonial missionaries taken together outnumbered those British missionaries of the Anglican establishment who might have wanted to make India into another fiefdom for their own Christendom. The very fact that so many Catholic missionaries were not British, being French, Italian, Irish, and so on, and that so many non-Catholic, evangelical, or Protestant missionaries were from North America or Northern Europe was bound to make this so. Opposition to the Raj, moreover, tended to increase as voluntarism drew more and more recruits from lower and lower classes or cultural levels of the Western world, and as these recruits came from faith societies beyond the control of mainline denominations with their established systems of ecclesiastical control. Indeed, at every stage during their struggle, anti-imperial nationalism in India received substantial and sympathetic support from missionaries. From Alan Hume and Verrier Erwin to Charles F. Andrews, Edward Thompson, and Amy Carmichael, many of whom became friends of Gandhi. In both theological and historical terms, therefore, caste was not just a matter of birth, but also of culture. Two Velar Christians of Thanjavur, Muthuswami Pillai and Vidanayakam Sastry, a Catholic and an evangelical, crystallized the central question: how could one God give one salvation for one humanity, and yet there still exist so many cultures? For them, there was no such thing as a Christian in the abstract or in general, but only a Christian or a community of Christians known in concrete and specific terms, with traits of language, birth, culture, education, and style particular to an environment. In holistic terms, primordial mankind was such an abstraction as were stories of origin and explanations of birth and caste. Thus, at the Lord's table, or the Eucharist, different people sat together separately, enjoying spiritual unity within a context of social diversity that allowed different people to live separately and to organize themselves hierarchically according to distinctions of caste in India or class in Europe. In his dialogue on the difference of caste, Vedanayakam told of European Christians sitting on benches, Velalar Christians sitting on grass mats, and Parayar or Shanar Christians sitting on the bare dirt or stone floor. according to their circumstances. None of these concrete circumstances was to be seen as immutable. But in waves of the radically changing culture climate of post-revolutionary America and Europe, there were those who felt they had a divine mandate to make sure that the intrinsic unity of mankind was more than a unit of abstract worth, and that such unity not only had to be made concrete, but had also to be individualized and made available to every human being. Implicit was the notion of a homogenizing and obliterating of all distinctions, so that cream and skim could no longer separate but remain together. Implicit was a democratizing and leveling ethos which justified in theological terms the total abolition of caste. That this was not the first time nor the last time that such injunctions were made would become obvious to each generation. Such concrete problems as worshiping together, sitting together, partaking of the same bread and cup together, singing the same songs together, having access to the same education together, and being admitted to the same ministry together, at each step along the way, the same conflicts rose. In 1830, Anglican Bishop Wilson reversed positions taken by Bishop Heber just 3 years earlier. While both Wilson and Charles Irenaeus were agreed on being opposed to the persistence of caste among converts, Wilson sacked Irenaeus for daring to question apostolic succession. Anglo-Saxon denominations went one way, and German Lutherans went another. In Thanjavur, during the 1850s, an SPG missionary, George Pope, insisted on having Tanjore Christians publicly flogged for refusing to abandon caste rules and strictures. Yet at that very same time, a CMS missionary was being attacked by fellow missionaries for focusing attention exclusively on Brahmins, to the exclusion of other peoples. Both were Anglicans. Roman Catholic missionaries also were no more of one mind about caste observances and practices among Indian Christians than in previous centuries. French missionaries along the Coromandel were more ready to respect existing caste and cultural norms. Irish missionaries opposed, and Italian missionaries were more evenly divided on such issues. When the great mass movements of conversion occurred among untouchable communities in Telugu country at the end of the 19th century, once again caste consciousness kept Malas and Madigas from mixing, and they have remained unmixed to this day. Each birth group had its own distinct sacred story, each its own Vamshavali, telling how its particular lineage had come out of the mists of antiquity and survived. Missionaries, as change agents, may have understood the procedures and values necessary for progress under the Raj, or helped to protect Christians and their interests when trouble arose over the law or in relations with Hindu or Muslim neighbors. But, as the evidence shows, they never resolved the caste culture question. Indeed, evidence also seems to indicate that no mass movement of conversions in India was ever led by a European. Put in the quaint language of Vedanayakam, as expressed earlier in the century, it took an elephant to catch an elephant, and a quail to catch a quail. As the 19th century came to an end, some theologically liberal missionaries, in the post-Darwinian climate, repeatedly confused conversion with civilization as worthy goals, and then went on to exalt and extol Brahmanical civilization. Among upper-class intellectually eclectic missionaries such as William Miller of Madras Christian College, a downward filtration theory was replaced by upward fulfillment as an excuse for explaining why Europeans had not been effective in bringing about conversions among the high caste elites of India. The Christian task was not so much to convert people as to permeate Indian society with Christian values. To do this, Christians needed to influence the elites who were taking to Western education in droves. Conversion was no longer seen as such a worthy goal, since much in the life and conduct of Hindus and Muslims was praiseworthy. A new strategy was articulated by J.N. Farquhar. Since all religions were, in some measure, divinely inspired, and since Hinduism was leading Indians towards Christianity, missionaries had only to devote more effort to dialogue and mutual understanding. This kind of thinking in the West, sometimes called fulfillment theory, gained some acceptance among some missionaries. It was put forward both in the Parliament of World Religions at Chicago in 1892 and in the World Missionary Conference at Edinburgh in 1910. Among some Indian Christians also, theological liberalism gained headway. In Bengal and North India, where there were relatively fewer Indian Christians and where there were Brahmin Christians, Anglican Krishna Mohan Banerjee argued in 1875 that Hindus could become Christians without abandoning their cultural or social traditions. Kali Charan Banerjee, in his Calcutta Christo Samaj, begun in 1887, required neither liturgy nor clergy, and Upadhyaya, a Brahmin Catholic, donned the ochre robes of a Swami and held that one could be both a Hindu and a Christian. In Maharashtra, Narayan Vaman Tilak, a prominent Brahmin Christian poet, founded a Christian ashram in 1917, and an Anglican Christa Siva Sangh Christian Service Society was established. In Madras, the National Church, founded in 1886, only survived into the 1920s. But when they said that Christianity in India should be Indian in culture, many later thinkers were saying something very different, something much less orthodox than what Vidanayakam Sastry or Roberto di Nobili would have had in mind, even when they used the same words. Theologically more conservative and pragmatic missionaries from lower levels of American, British, and European societies tended to work within an entirely different cultural ethos, and to be ignored by upper-class missionaries. Thus, radical nonconformists, already critically conscious that Methodism in Britain was no longer working class, but becoming middle class, saw a dangerous loss of spiritual fire. For them, and for many others, theological liberalism was a more serious problem than caste or culture. Such missionaries from whatever country criticized those who now failed to bring the gospel, and who only prepared high caste Hindus for lucrative careers, while at the same time neglecting the plight of low caste Christians and failing to help them to overcome cultural, economic, and social disabilities. Officers of the Salvation Army, arriving in the 1880s, while theologically conservative, abandoned European clothes, furnishings, food, and even music, took Indian Christian names, and adopted as many elements of Indian culture as possible in order to identify themselves with the downtrodden. Pandita Ramabai, the Brahmin widow who had won such renown in Varanasi for her high learning, had become a Christian while in Britain. Feted among high society women's missionary circles in the eastern states of America, she had turned away from those elites and their rationalizing theologies and ended up among Pentecostals in California before returning to found her Mukti mission for female orphans and widows. Among Catholic and Thomas Christians also, the same kinds of processes developed. Theological liberalism was also increasingly challenged by more conservative Christian missionary thinkers. Among these, the most influential was Hendrik Kramer, a Dutch theologian working in Indonesia. Looking at resurgent forms of anti-Christian Islamic militancy, he took a Barthian theological position. His Christian Message in a Non-Christian World, written for the International Missionary Conference at Tambaram, just south of Madras, in 1938, reminded Christians that their faith was fundamentally and intrinsically different from any religion. Christian faith, he argued, was not man-made, but God-given. All religions, even certain elements found in Christianity, were of merely human origin. It was important to know where the differences lay. Meanwhile, among Roman Catholics also, old controversies continued, some going back centuries, over such matters as rites of different kind, Latin and Malabar as well as Chinese. Pope Benedict XIV in 1744 held that Catholics of high and low birth alike should hear the same Mass, taking the same communion, and meet in the same building at the same time. Even such regulations could be modified in implementation. Jesuits in South India erected little walls and opened different doors for the high and the low castes. Thanjavur Christians arranged for different castes to sit in separate quadrants of nave and transept. After all, slave Christians in America worshipped in their own chapels, and servants in Europe sat in back galleries. In problems over training clergy, rival Catholic jurisdictions, Padroado and Propaganda Fide, often favored separate castes. The Mukavan fisherfolk petitioned Rome, asking how, if a fisherman could be the first pope, they could be considered not worthy enough for clerical training and ordination. One apostolic delegate in 1902 pointed out that while no descendants of De Nobilis Brahmin converts remained in the church, many descendants of Perivas, converted by St. Francis Xavier, remained faithful. If anything, problems of caste and culture seemed to become more and more formidable. Mass movements, with whole villages becoming Christian, a phenomenon which had occurred at the end of the 18th century and again in the late 19th century among both evangelicals and Catholics, became a focal point of nationalist opposition in the 20th century. Such movements were severely criticized by higher caste Hindus, including Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi went so far as openly to chastise India's first native Anglican bishop, Vendanayakam Acharya, accusing him of betraying the nation for his leadership of mass conversions in Dornakal. But untouchable communities, denied access to temples, commonwealths, or other facilities enjoyed by clean caste peoples, had hitherto never counted as Hindu. The charge that such converts were only motivated by material considerations was refuted by Indian Christians. Advocates of mass conversion argued that all human motives are mixed, and that imperfect motives need not nullify the genuineness of conversions. For despised peoples to desire a fuller life for themselves and for their children could hardly be considered something unworthy, ignoble, or unpatriotic. Vendanayakam Acharya was himself a Nadar from Tirunelveli, the son of a village pastor. His consecration as Bishop of Dornakal in 1912 and subsequent shepherding of a mass movement of Telugu speakers into Christianity symbolized both the work of Schwartz Satyanathan Pillai and Vedanayakam Sastri a century earlier, and the beginning of the Indianization of church leadership in the 20th century. The continent since 1947. Since partition in 1947 and the emergence of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, not to mention the autonomous neighboring states of Burma, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, missionaries from abroad have almost disappeared, with just a few exceptions. Radical religious and social movements, accompanied by far-reaching cross-cultural transformations generated within Hindu-Muslim or Indian environments, have, however, continued to accelerate, together with a welter of competitive fundamentalist and revivalist enthusiasms. Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh. Indian independence in 1947 brought more cries for Christians in India and the churches to which they belonged to become more Indian. Especially noxious were some of the denominational divisions and boundaries which alien missionaries had drawn. Many mainline groups, such as Anglicans, Congregationalists, and Methodists, banded together to form the Church of South India. Bishop V. Azaria was the principal Indian leader in the movement to create the CSI, but he died in 1945, too early to see it inaugurated in the same year that India became independent. In 1970, a much weaker Church of North India and a Protestant Church of Pakistan came into being. Baptists and Lutherans, together with many Anabaptist and Free Church people, retained their separate identities and communities. The same, of course, is true for the 6 to 10 Syrian and Thomas Christian communions of Kerala. The Roman Catholic Church continued to struggle with the anomaly of the Padroado, fully resolved only after the Indian occupation of Goa in 1961. That the Portuguese should continue to have any ecclesiastical authority within an independent India was unthinkable, and in due course elements of this anachronism were gradually ended. Not until the last Portuguese Bishop of Cochin retired in 1952 were animosities there between high caste and low caste Christians resolved. 2 dioceses were formed, with a bishop of appropriate birth for each. Since then, the Indianization of the Catholic Church has developed around 3 principal themes. The first is how to implement the decrees of the Second Vatican Council, 1962 through 65, encouraging adaptation and pluralism, especially in relation to the liturgy. The high point here was the All India Seminar at Bangalore, Pentecost, 1969, but the implementation of its resolutions became bogged down in fears that Indianization looked to some too much like Hinduization. The second has been the often fraught relationship between Latin Catholics on the one hand and Catholics within the Syro-Malabar and Syro-Malankara churches on the other. The latter represent some of the most dynamic groups within Indian Catholicism, but only in 1987 did Pope John Paul allow them to expand their diocesan organization away from Kerala. The third theme is the development of Christian ashrams following the example of Jules Monchanin, Abhishek Tananda, and B.D. Griffiths. Particularly significant here is the founding at Kurisumula, Kerala, by Francis Acharya, of an ashram combining a Cistercian pattern of life with the Syro-Malankara rite. The Indian Catholic Church appears unique in the Southern Hemisphere for the number of its clergy, both diocesan and religious. In this, it contrasts strikingly with the Church in the Philippines and in most of Latin America and Africa. If in general the number of Jesuits is declining in the world, in India they have grown remarkably, providing distinguished intellectual leadership. In consequence, Indian Catholicism has not been as subject to new waves of Pentecostalist Protestantism in the way that the Catholic Church, suffering acute shortages of priests, has been in many countries. On the contrary, India now exports Catholic missionaries, just as South Korea, for instance, exports evangelical missionaries. Resentments and suspicions remain. Hindu nationalists continue to view Indian Christians as belonging to a foreign power. The government of Madhya Pradesh, homeland of the RSS, appointed a commission of inquiry which, in its report, labeled Indian Christians anti-national, a foreign hand subject to American influence. The controversy aroused national attention. Evidence was presented to the effect that Christianity in India had a long history, and that it had long been truly and authentically Indian. As had been usual since early in the century, Hindu attacks focused upon Christian proselytizing activities. Hindu hostility toward Christianity has grown stronger with each passing decade. This has been led by various political parties and religious agencies, such as the RSS, BJP, VHP, Shiv Sena, and Bajrang Dal. These now make up what is sometimes known as the Sangh Parivar, or Society of Families, or as the Saffron Brotherhood. Christian church buildings are now regularly destroyed in various parts of the continent, usually on the pretext that they were built under colonial rule and that they stand upon foundations of some former temple. Indian Christians may, in some areas, be attacked and killed, usually in rather small, isolated incidents, but that is not entirely exceptional in societies where there is much communal violence. The response of Indian Christians to such incidents has been mixed. Some, such as the Catholic Shoreline Movement, are militantly self-assertive and ready to take up arms in defense of their own territories. Others, such as the Mennonites, are quietistic, choosing rather to prove themselves to be twice Christian, if not also twice as Indian as anyone else. On the other hand, some Christians still enjoy situations of social privilege, since most Christians, but especially Catholics, are concentrated in urban areas, and since Christians possess some of the finest educational institutions in the country, with elites of the Indian aristocracy often preferring to send their own children to Christian schools, some Christian communities of India enjoy a disproportionate share of positions within the privileged sectors and strata of society. Many Thomas Christians of Kerala, a state with the highest literacy in all of India, enjoy positions in government, business, and the professions. In Nagaland, where over 95% of the population are Christians, they inevitably occupy virtually all senior positions. At the opposite end of the spectrum are Indian Christians from the poorest classes, many of them still located in rural areas and untouchable communities. Legally, they should be called scheduled castes, backward castes, and other backward castes, within which some Adivasi or tribal Christian communities are also fitted. But politically, Christians are not counted among these disadvantaged groups because of the technicality of their being defined as Christian and not Hindu, with the resultant loss of many government welfare benefits which are not extended to them. Yet 2 or 3 powerful movements have begun to stir Christians at this level. First, there is the Dalit movement, with a separate Dalit Christian movement. Dalit means broken or crushed or oppressed, as when a boot grinds a glass bangle into the dirt. For the last 2 decades, this movement has been growing with ever more intensity. Similarly, there are also resistance movements among Adivasis, the Aboriginal or tribal peoples of the Northeast, many of whom are Christian. Nagaland is indeed the one state in India to have a Christian majority. Secondly, perhaps the largest single movement of Christian awakening and conversion is the Pentecostal movement, with all of its manifold branches throughout India. This is particularly active and notable within the large urban areas. Finally, and somewhat related, are continuing conversion movements among various communities. Growth in numbers of Indian Christians in all communities seems clear, but there are claims among Indian Christians that their numbers are undercounted or not recorded, for political reasons partly related to the political manipulation of census gathering and reporting. Whatever the case, the aggregated total is estimated to be not less than 50 millions. Among these, Catholics remain the largest single Christian community, but there are substantial non-Catholic community, both Thomas and evangelical, with perhaps the largest aggregations being among formerly Adivasi and Dalit populations. This ends chapter 5.